The blast doors of the industrial processing facility shuddered open with a grinding mechanical scream that echoed across the chemical-stained rock-crete floor. Through the breach came the harsh white light of Necromunda's artificial sun, casting long shadows across the corpses of factory workers who had died at their stations 3 days ago when the atmospheric recyclers failed. The bodies lay twisted among the machinery they had served faithfully until toxic fumes choked the life from their lungs. Marcus Kane pressed himself against a support beam, feeling the rough metal dig into his back through his torn flak vest. His breathing came in ragged gasps, each inhalation burning his throat with the acrid taste of industrial chemicals and fear. The heavy footsteps of his pursuers echoed through the facility, growing closer with each passing second. Kane, the voice cut through the mechanical ambience like a blade. You can't run forever, you worthless Grok's dung. The Syndicate always collects its debts. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to steady his hands, but they continued to shake with the tremor that had plagued him since Kodia fell. Since he watched his entire regiment die in the green fire of Necron weapons while he cowered in a bunker, too paralyzed by terror to join them in their final charge. The memories came flooding back unbidden, the screams of burning men, the smell of vaporized flesh, the terrible silence that followed. He had been a Cadian shock trooper once, a proud guardian of the Imperium, trained from birth to stand firm against the enemies of mankind. Now he was just another broken veteran scraping out a living on the edge of civilized space, taking whatever mercenary work he could find to keep the nightmares at bay. The last job had gone bad when his employers discovered he had been skimming credits from their weapon shipments. Desperation made men do terrible things. "Found some blood here," called another voice. "Fresh. He's close." Marcus gripped the auto pistol in his hands, checking the clip out of habit. 3 rounds left. Not nearly enough to fight his way out of this mess. The Crimson Talon Syndicate didn't send collection teams after small-time debtors unless they wanted to make an example. He had seen what they did to people who couldn't pay. The lucky ones died quickly. A shadow moved past his hiding spot, and Marcus held his breath until his lungs burned. The Enforcer wore the red leather coat that marked him as one of the Syndicate's elite, his face hidden behind a skull-faced respirator that gave him the appearance of death itself. The man's augmetic arm ended in a vicious-looking power claw that sparked with contained energy. Marcus Kane. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the metal walls with unnatural clarity. Former guardsman, current disappointment to the human race. You owe the Syndicate 40,000 throne gelt, plus interest, plus the cost of hunting you down. That comes to, let's call it, 60,000. Marcus said nothing, pressing himself deeper into the shadows. Sweat ran down his face, despite the facility's cold atmosphere, mixing with the grime and chemical residue that coated everything in the lower levels of the hive. "I know you're listening," the Enforcer continued, his tone conversational. "Your service record makes for interesting reading. Survived the fall of Cadia, though not exactly with honor. Lost your nerve when it mattered most. Now you steal from honest criminals to fund your drinking habit. Pathetic." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Each accusation was true, each failure catalogued and measured. He had fallen so far from the soldier he once was that even criminals found him contemptible. "Come out now, and I'll make it quick," the Enforcer said. "Keep hiding, and I'll take you to the pain merchants. They'll keep you alive for weeks while they practice their craft on your worthless flesh." Marcus closed his eyes and made his decision. He stepped out from behind the support beam, auto pistol raised but knowing it was useless against the Enforcer's carapace armor. At least he would die on his feet instead of cowering in the shadows like the coward everyone believed him to be. But the Enforcer was gone. Marcus spun around, searching the facility's dimly lit interior, but the red-coated figure had vanished as if he had never existed. The other voices had fallen silent as well, leaving only the mechanical humming of damaged machinery and the distant sound of the hive's ventilation systems. "What in the Emperor's name?" Marcus whispered, his weapon still raised. A soft sound made him turn toward the facility's main entrance. There, standing in the harsh white light, was a figure unlike anything he had ever seen. It was humanoid, but wrong in ways that made his eyes water to look at directly. The being wore robes that seemed to shift and flow like liquid shadow, and its face was hidden behind a mask of polished silver that reflected no light. The figure said nothing, but raised one pale hand to reveal a small device resting in its palm. The object was beautiful in a way that hurt to perceive, a multifaceted pyramid of what looked like crystallized starlight, its surfaces dancing with colors that had no names in any human language. Marcus felt drawn to the device despite every instinct screaming at him to run. The pyramid pulsed with soft light, and with each pulse, he heard whispers in his mind. Promises of escape, wealth beyond measure, a chance to wash away the stain of his failures and become something greater than he had ever imagined possible. His hand moved without conscious thought, reaching toward the beautiful artifact. The moment his fingers made contact with its surface, reality shattered around him in a cascade of impossible geometries and non-Euclidean angles. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the silver mask tilting in what might have been satisfaction. 3,000 kilometers away, in the rusted depths of Hive Primus's industrial sector, Anya Korvash pressed her back against the cold metal of a ventilation shaft and listened to the sound of her own blood dripping onto the floor. The last bolt had taken her in the shoulder, burning through her leather jacket and leaving a cauterized wound that throbbed with each heartbeat. She was going to die in this place. Alone, forgotten, just another ganger who had reached too high and paid the price. The heist had been perfect on paper. Hit the Goliath storage depot during shift change, grabbed the Archaeotech cache that House Delac Intelligence said was hidden in sub-level 7, and fade back into the Underhive before anyone knew they were there. Easy money for her crew, and enough to finally buy their way out of the gang wars that consumed lives like fuel. But someone had sold them out. The Goliaths were waiting when they rappelled down from the ceiling access, their heavy stubbers already spinning up to speed. Anya watched her crew die in the first seconds of the ambush, Mikhail cut in half by sustained fire, Vera's head vaporized by a bolt shell, young Korin screaming as last fire cooked him inside his armor. Only Anya's reflexes had saved her, diving behind a plasteel crate while death filled the air around her. She had fought her way to the ventilation system, leaving 3 Goliath gangers dead behind her, but not before taking the hit that was slowly bleeding her to death. The sound of boots on metal made her tense. They were still hunting her, following the blood trail through the maze of ducts and service corridors that formed the Hive's circulatory system. She could hear their voices echoing through the vents, crude jokes about what they would do to her when they found her. Anya checked her stub gun, counting the remaining rounds by feel. 4 shots left in the clip, 1 spare magazine in her belt. Against how many? She had seen at least a dozen gangers during the firefight, and the Goliaths had a reputation for thoroughness. They wouldn't stop hunting until they had her head mounted on their territory markers. "Little rat," called a voice from somewhere below her position. "We know you're bleeding out up there. Come down and we'll make it quick. Keep running and we'll take our time." Anya said nothing, conserving her strength for the fight to come. She had been raised in the depths of Necromunda, where showing weakness was the same as signing your own death warrant. The strong survived, the weak became corpse starch, and the smart knew when to cut their losses and run. But there was nowhere to run. The Goliaths controlled the territory between her and safety, and her wound was slowing her down with every passing minute. Soon, she would be too weak to fight, and then it would be over. "Found more blood," another voice reported. "Fresh drops. She's in shaft 77 Gamma, heading toward the reclamation center." The sound of movement filled the vents around her as her hunters closed in. Anya pulled herself forward on her elbows, ignoring the pain that lanced through her shoulder with every movement. The shaft ahead split into 3 directions, but she could hear voices coming from all of them. They had her surrounded. She rolled onto her back and raised her weapon, waiting for the first face to appear around the corner. At least she would take some of them with her when she went. The gang wars had taught her that much. Always make them pay for killing you. But no face appeared. Instead, the voices simply stopped, as if someone had activated a sound dampener across the entire facility. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant hum of machinery and her own labored breathing. Anya waited, weapon trained on the intersection ahead, but nothing moved. The hunters who had been closing in from 3 directions had simply vanished, leaving her alone in the ventilation system with her wounds and her confusion. A soft sound made her turn her head. At the far end of the shaft, barely visible in the dim emergency lighting, stood a figure that had no business being in this place. It was tall and graceful, wearing robes that seemed to drink in the light around them, and its face was hidden behind a mask of polished silver. The figure extended one pale hand, revealing a small device resting in its palm. The object was beautiful beyond description, a crystalline pyramid that seemed to contain captured starlight, its faceted surfaces reflecting colors that shouldn't exist. As Anya stared at it, she heard whispers at the edge of her consciousness, promising escape from the pain and the hunting and the endless cycle of violence that defined her existence. Her hand moved without conscious thought, reaching toward the impossible artifact. She knew it was dangerous, knew that nothing in the Underhive was ever offered freely, but she was dying anyway. What did she have to lose? The moment her fingers touched the pyramid's surface, reality folded in on itself like origami made of light and shadow. The last thing she experienced before consciousness fled was a sensation of falling upward into an infinite sky. In the sterile halls of Orbital Station Lysander, Administratum Scribe 3rd Class Jackson Muir sat in his cell and tried not to think about what awaited him when the transport ship arrived. The charges against him were fabricated, he knew that much. Junior Supervisor Valkus needed a scapegoat for the missing supply shipments, and Jackson was expendable enough to serve the purpose. Trafficking in forbidden Xenos artifacts, collaborating with enemies of the Imperium, heretical practices in violation of the Imperial Creed. The accusations were absurd, but the evidence had been planted with professional skill. Jackson's own access codes had been used to authorize the shipments. His personal data slate contained communication records with known criminal elements, and his quarters had yielded a collection of Xenos artifacts that he had never seen before in his life. The trial had lasted less than an hour. The Arbit's judge had pronounced him guilty without even looking at the evidence, and the sentence was transportation to a penal colony where his life expectancy would be measured in months rather than years. It was efficient, tidy, and completely unjust. Jackson pulled his thin blanket closer around his shoulders and tried to ignore the cold that seemed to seep through the cell's metal walls. He was a small man, soft from years of administrative work, with the pale complexion of someone who had spent his entire adult life under artificial lighting. The other prisoners in the detention block were hardened criminals and military dissidents who regarded him with a mixture of contempt and predatory interest. Fresh meat, one of them had called him during the evening meal distribution. Bet he doesn't last a week on the mining world. The comment had drawn laughter from the others, harsh and mocking. They had all heard about the penal colonies, places where human life was worth less than the minerals extracted from hostile worlds. Convicts died of cave-ins, toxic atmospheres, equipment failures, and simple exhaustion. The lucky ones succumbed to radiation poisoning before they experienced the more creative forms of death that awaited the unlucky. Jackson had dedicated his life to serving the Imperium with quiet efficiency. He processed supply requisitions, maintained shipping manifests, and ensured that the vast bureaucratic machine functioned smoothly. It was not glorious work, but it was necessary, and he had taken pride in doing it well. Now that dedication had been turned against him, his own competence used as evidence of his guilt. The cell door opened with a hydraulic hiss, and an Arbit's enforcer stepped inside. The man's face was hidden behind the skull-faced helmet of his office, and his voice emerged from the Vox grill with mechanical distortion. "Moore," the enforcer said. "Transport's been delayed. Mechanical problems with the ship's warp drive. You've got another day to contemplate your sins." Jackson nodded without looking up. Another day in this place, surrounded by genuine criminals who regarded him as prey. Another day to think about how his careful, ordered life had collapsed into chaos through the malice of one corrupt supervisor. The enforcer turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I've seen the evidence files. Sloppy work, too neat by half. Someone wanted you gone real bad." The admission hung in the air between them, a small acknowledgement of the injustice that had been done. Then the enforcer left, and Jackson was alone again with his thoughts and his fear. He tried to pray, reciting the litany of protection from memory, but the words felt hollow in his mouth. Where was the Emperor's protection when honest men were framed for crimes they didn't commit? Where was the divine justice that was supposed to distinguish between the guilty and the innocent? The lights in the detention block dimmed to their night cycle setting, and Jackson lay down on his thin mattress. Tomorrow he would be loaded onto a transport ship with dozens of other convicts, chained in the cargo hold like livestock. The journey to the penal colony would take weeks, during which time the strong would prey on the weak and many would die before they ever reached their destination. A soft sound made him open his eyes. The cell was darker than it should have been, as if something was absorbing the light from the corridor beyond. In the corner, barely visible in the gloom, stood a figure that had no business being in a maximum security detention facility. The being was tall and elegant, wearing robes that seemed to be cut from liquid shadow. Its face was hidden behind a mask of polished silver that reflected no light, and it moved with a grace that suggested it was not entirely bound by the same physical laws that governed human motion. The figure extended one pale hand, revealing a small device resting in its palm. The object was beautiful beyond description, a crystalline pyramid that contained what looked like captured starlight, its surfaces dancing with colors that had no names. As Jackson stared at it, he heard whispers in his mind, promising escape from the chains and the transport ship and the slow death that awaited him on some distant mining world. His hand moved without conscious thought, reaching toward the impossible artifact. He knew he should be afraid, knew that nothing good ever came from mysterious figures offering miraculous escapes. But what did he have to lose? His life was already forfeit, his future already decided by forces beyond his control. The moment his fingers made contact with the pyramid's surface, reality bent around him like heated metal. The last sensation he experienced before darkness claimed him was the feeling of being dissolved and reconstituted in the space between heartbeats. Marcus Kane woke to the sound of screaming. He opened his eyes to find himself lying on a cold metal floor in a vast chamber filled with hundreds of other people. The architecture around him was alien in a way that made his eyes hurt to look at directly. All sharp angles and impossible curves, surfaces that seemed to bend light around them in defiance of natural law. The other occupants of the chamber were dressed in identical gray fatigues marked with numbers, their own clothes apparently confiscated while they were unconscious. Marcus sat up slowly, his head spinning with disorientation, and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The crowd included people from every level of Imperial society. He could see former guardsmen like himself, their military bearing obvious despite their civilian clothes. Gang members with ritual scars and crude tattoos. Hive nobles wearing expressions of outraged disbelief. Administratum functionaries clutching data slates that no longer worked. Tech adepts whose augmetic components had been deactivated. Even a few individuals wearing the psychic dampening collars used to restrain unsanctioned psychers. All of them shared the same expression of confusion and growing terror as they tried to understand where they were and how they had gotten there. "What is this place?" a woman near Marcus demanded. She had the look of a void ship officer, her bearing suggesting command experience. "I demand to know who is responsible for this outrage." Her words were met with nervous laughter from some of the other captives. Demands and outrage seemed foolish in a place that defied every assumption about how reality was supposed to work. Marcus pushed himself to his feet and began moving through the crowd, searching for answers. The chamber was enormous, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. The walls were covered in what looked like flowing script in a language that hurt to read, symbols that seemed to writhe and change when observed directly. Near the far end of the chamber, he spotted two familiar faces. Anya Korvash sat with her back against one of the alien walls, her shoulder bandaged with strips of gray fabric. Beside her, a small pale man with the soft look of an administrative worker was staring at his hands as if he couldn't believe they were real. Marcus approached them carefully, noting the wary way Anya tracked his movement. Even in this impossible situation, her gang instincts remained sharp. "You're the ganger from the lower hive," Marcus said. "I saw your face on the bounty boards." Anya Korvash, suspected of multiple homicides and theft. Anya's eyes narrowed. "And you're Marcus Kane, former Cadian shock trooper, current failure and disgrace to the uniform. What of it?" The pale man looked up at them with frightened eyes. "Please," he said quietly. "I don't understand what's happening. I was in my cell and then there was this figure with a silver mask, and now I'm here with all of you. This has to be some kind of mistake." "No mistake," said a new voice behind them. They turned to see a massive man approaching, his bulk marking him as one of the pit fighters who entertained the hive nobility with blood sport. Crude scars covered his arms and face, and his eyes held the flat calculation of a predator sizing up potential prey. "We're all here for the same reason. We all took the deal." "What deal?" the pale man asked. The pit fighter smiled, revealing teeth filed to points. "The pyramid, the silver mask, the promise of escape. We all touched the thing, didn't we? And now we're here, wherever here is." Before anyone could respond, the lights in the chamber dimmed and the screaming stopped as if someone had activated a switch. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise had been, a pregnant pause that suggested something was about to happen. A section of the far wall dissolved, revealing an opening large enough for several people to walk through side by side. Through the gap came figures that made every human in the chamber instinctively recoil. They wore armor that looked like it had been forged from liquid shadow and sharpened to a razor's edge, their movements displaying an alien grace that spoke of enhanced reflexes and predatory intent. The warriors' faces were hidden behind helmets that resembled the skulls of some unknown xeno species, and they carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. Marcus recognized them from intelligence briefings he had received during his military service. Drukhari Kabbaliti warriors, the elite soldiers of the Dark City of Komara. The Dark Eldar moved through the crowd of humans with casual efficiency, using shock mauls to disable anyone who showed resistance. Their weapons discharged crackling arcs of neural disruptor energy that left victims convulsing on the floor, their nervous systems temporarily scrambled. "Nobody move!" shouted one of the former guardsmen, a grizzled veteran with sergeant stripes tattooed on his arm. "These are Xeno's hostiles. Form defensive positions and—" His words were cut off as one of the Kabbalite warriors fired a splinter rifle into his chest. The crystalline projectile punched through his sternum and delivered its payload of exotic toxins directly into his bloodstream. The man's body convulsed once, then went rigid as the paralytic agents took effect. He remained conscious, but completely unable to move, his eyes tracking the alien warrior who stepped over his prone form with contempt. The message was clear. Resistance would be met with swift and merciless response, but death was not necessarily the intended outcome. Whatever these Xenos had planned, they wanted their captives alive and functional. When the crowd had been sufficiently cowed, the air above them shimmered and a massive holographic projection materialized in the center of the chamber. The image showed a figure that was unmistakably Drukhari, but unlike the armored warriors below. This one wore robes of deep purple that seemed to absorb light, and his pale face was marked with intricate scarification that formed patterns pleasing to some alien aesthetic. The being was beautiful in the way that poisonous creatures were beautiful, elegant and dangerous and utterly without mercy. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute power backed by casual cruelty. "Welcome, Mon-Ki," the figure said, using the Drukhari term for humans that carried connotations of livestock. "I am Archon Viraxis of the Cabal of the Crimson Thorn, and you have the singular honor of being selected for my latest entertainment." The hologram moved as he spoke, the projection technology so advanced that it seemed like the Archon was actually present in the chamber. His dark eyes swept across the crowd of humans with predatory interest, cataloging their reactions to his presence. "You are in the dark city of Komara," he continued, "the nexus of my people's realm in the webway. You were chosen not for any virtue or accomplishment, but for your desperation. Each of you was offered escape from circumstances that would have led to your destruction, and each of you accepted without hesitation. This weakness has brought you to my attention." The words struck Marcus like physical blows. The Archon was right. He had accepted the mysterious offer without question because the alternative was death at the hands of the Syndicate. How many of the others had made the same choice, trading unknown danger for certain doom? "You will participate in what I call the Archon's folly," Viraxis continued, his tone suggesting amusement at some private joke. "A series of 6 games designed to test your worthiness as entertainment. Those who prove amusing will advance to the next challenge. Those who bore me will be eliminated in whatever manner strikes my fancy." A murmur of fear ran through the crowd, but the Kabbalite warriors raised their weapons and the sound quickly died. "The rules are simple," the Archon said. "Survive each game and you may proceed to the next. Fail and your suffering will provide a brief moment of pleasure for those watching. At the end, a single survivor will remain to claim a prize beyond mortal comprehension." The hologram flickered and changed, showing images that made several humans in the crowd vomit, bodies twisted by alien technology into impossible configurations. Minds flayed and rebuilt according to Drukhari aesthetic preferences. Souls trapped in crystalline matrices where they would experience eternal torment for the amusement of their captors. "Your first game begins in 1 hour," Viraxis announced. "I suggest you use the time to make peace with whatever gods you worship. They will not be able to help you in the trials ahead." The hologram dissolved, leaving the humans alone with their captors and their fear. The Kabbalite warriors began herding them toward the opening in the wall, using shock mauls to encourage compliance. Marcus found himself moving alongside Anya and the pale administrative worker, their shared horror creating a fragile bond of mutual sympathy. "I'm Jackson," the small man said quietly as they walked through corridors that defied geometric logic. "Jackson Muir. I'm a scribe. Was a scribe. I processed shipping manifests." "Marcus Kane," Marcus replied. "Former guardsman. And you already know Anya." Anya said nothing. Her attention focused on memorizing the layout of the alien facility. Even in captivity, she was looking for opportunities and escape routes, though Marcus doubted any existed in this place. The corridors they moved through were works of art that happened to be functional architecture. The walls were covered in bas-relief carvings that depicted scenes of torture and degradation so detailed that they seemed to move in peripheral vision. Soft lighting emanated from sources that couldn't be identified, casting everything in a sickly purple glow that made human skin look corpse-pale. They passed chambers filled with alien technology that hummed with malevolent purpose, laboratories where strange experiments were conducted on subjects that might once have been human, and galleries lined with trophies taken from 1,000 conquered worlds. The Dark City was a monument to cruelty, elevated to the level of high art, a place where suffering had been refined into its purest possible form. Eventually, they reached their destination, a vast arena whose floor was covered in mud mixed with what looked like old blood. At the far end, perhaps 500 meters away, Marcus could see a finish line marked with pulsing Xeno script. But what dominated the space was the massive object mounted in the center of the killing ground. It was the head of an Emperor-class Titan, one of the Imperium's greatest war machines, but obviously salvaged from some ancient battlefield. The skull-like superstructure had been mounted on a tripod of alien metal, its cathedral-sized proportions making the humans below look like insects. Most of the Titan's weapons had been removed, but one remained functional, a Vulcan mega-bolter whose multiple barrels were aimed at the arena floor. The Titan's remaining eye was dark, but Marcus could see the targeting systems within its armored housing. Whatever game the Drukhari had planned, that weapon would be part of it. The humans were pushed out onto the arena floor and arranged in a rough line facing the finish line. There were perhaps 400 of them now, Marcus estimated, though it was hard to get an accurate count in the confusion. The Drukhari spectators filled the stands around the arena, their alien faces displaying expressions of eager anticipation. Above them, Archon Viraxis appeared on a viewing platform that extended out over the arena floor. His voice boomed across the space, amplified by technology that made every word perfectly clear, despite the distance. "Welcome to your first trial," he announced. "The game is simple. Reach the finish line before time expires, but beware. You are being watched by the machine spirit of this glorious Titan, a prize from one of our raids against your pathetic Imperium. When its eye glows green and you hear the hymnal, you may move freely. When the eye turns red and the music stops, you must remain absolutely still. Anyone detected moving during the red phase will be eliminated." The Titan's eyes suddenly blazed to life, casting the arena in emerald radiance. From hidden speakers came the sound of an Imperial hymn, but the melody was wrong, distorted into something that hurt to hear. The familiar words of praise to the Emperor had been twisted into blasphemous verses that spoke of submission and despair. "Begin," Viraxis commanded. For a moment, nobody moved. The combination of alien technology and corrupted Imperial symbols was so wrong that it paralyzed the mind with its implications. Then survival instinct took over, and the humans began to run. Marcus started forward at a steady pace, his military training taking over despite the bizarre circumstances. The mud sucked at his feet and made running difficult, but he maintained his balance and kept moving toward the distant finish line. Around him, other contestants were struggling with the treacherous footing, some falling face first into the muck. The green light lasted for perhaps 30 seconds, long enough for the fastest runners to cover a third of the distance. Then the Titan's eye flicked to red, and the hymnal cut off with mechanical precision. Marcus froze mid-stride, one foot raised from the mud, every muscle locked in place. Around him, hundreds of other humans had done the same, creating a tableau of desperate people caught in motion. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of labored breathing and the distant laughter of Drukhari spectators. A man near Marcus's position shifted slightly, trying to maintain his balance in the unstable mud. The movement was barely perceptible, but the Titan's targeting systems detected it instantly. The Vulcan mega-bolter swiveled with mechanical precision and fired a burst of mass-reactive shells. The explosive rounds hit the man-center mass and detonated inside his body, reducing him to a cloud of blood and fragments that rained down on the nearby contestants. The sound of the weapon was deafening in the enclosed space, and several humans flinched involuntarily at the noise. More weapons fire followed as the targeting system identified and eliminated those who had moved. The mega-bolter spoke again and again, each burst claiming another life with mechanical efficiency. In seconds, perhaps 50 people had been reduced to scattered pieces that mixed with the mud beneath their feet. The red light lasted for nearly a minute before the Titan's eye returned to green, and the distorted hymnal resumed. The survivors began moving again, but more cautiously now, their confidence shattered by the casual slaughter they had witnessed. Marcus found himself running alongside Anya, who moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to violent environments. Her gang training served her well here, teaching her to stay calm under fire and make quick decisions when death was only a moment away. "Stay close to me," she said quietly as they ran. "I've got a feel for the timing now." Jackson was struggling behind them, his soft administrative lifestyle having ill-prepared him for this kind of physical trial. Marcus could see the panic in the man's eyes as he fell further and further behind the other contestants. The green phase lasted longer this time, perhaps 45 seconds, allowing the survivors to cover more distance. But when the red light returned, the targeting system was merciless in its efficiency. Anyone who moved, stumbled, or lost their balance was immediately eliminated by the Titan's weapons. A woman near the finish line tried to take one more step during the red phase, thinking she could reach safety before being detected. The mega bolter tracked her movement and fired the explosive shells, reducing her to component atoms just meters from victory. Marcus forced himself to remain perfectly still as fragments of her body spattered against his face. The warm wetness mixed with the mud already coating his skin, creating a grotesque mask that he dared not wipe away. Around him, other survivors were experiencing the same horror, their faces reflecting the psychological trauma of watching their fellow humans die for the entertainment of alien monsters. When the green light returned, there were perhaps 200 contestants left. The arena floor was littered with body parts and blood that mixed with the mud to create a churning morass of human remains. The stench was overwhelming: burned flesh, spilled blood, and the acrid smell of explosive residue. Marcus grabbed Jackson's arm and pulled the smaller man forward, half carrying him through the treacherous footing. The scribe was on the verge of collapse, his soft hands torn and bleeding from multiple falls. But Marcus had sworn an oath to protect the innocent, and despite everything that had happened, some part of that vow still mattered to him. "I can't," Jackson gasped. "I can't keep going. Just leave me." "Like hell," Marcus replied, tightening his grip on the man's arm. "We stick together, or we die together." Anya moved past them with predatory efficiency, her survival instincts focused entirely on her own preservation. She had no energy to waste on helping the weak, not when her own life hung in the balance. Marcus couldn't blame her for the choice, but he couldn't make it himself. The final green phase brought them within sight of the finish line. Marcus could see the pulsing Xenos script that marked the boundary of safety, still 50 meters away but finally achievable. He pulled Jackson forward, ignoring the smaller man's exhausted protests, determined to get them both across the line alive. When the red light came for the last time, Marcus found himself in the most precarious position yet. He was mid-stride, his weight balanced on one foot while Jackson hung from his other arm. The scribe was slipping, his grip weakening as unconsciousness threatened to take him. Marcus felt Jackson's hand slide through his grasp and knew the man was about to fall. If Jackson hit the ground during the red phase, the targeting system would kill them both. There was no time to think, only to act on instinct. He shifted his weight and caught Jackson in a fireman's carry, lifting the smaller man off the ground just as his knees buckled. The movement was minimal, barely perceptible, but Marcus held his breath and waited for the megabolter to find him. Seconds passed. The targeting system swept across their position, its sensors probing for signs of movement, but apparently registered their new configuration as stable. Marcus remained frozen in place, muscles screaming from the effort of maintaining the awkward position until the green light finally returned. He ran the final 50 meters with Jackson on his back, crossing the finish line just as the time limit expired. Behind them, the Titan's weapons fired one final burst, eliminating a group of contestants who had been only meters from safety. Marcus collapsed to his knees and let Jackson slide to the ground, both men gasping for breath in the sudden quiet. Around them, perhaps 60 other survivors had made it across the line, their faces reflecting the same mixture of relief and horror that he felt. Anya was among the survivors, having crossed the line well ahead of the others. She looked at Marcus with something that might have been respect as he helped Jackson to his feet. "Good soldier," she said quietly. "But that kind of heroism won't serve you in the games to come." Before Marcus could respond, the arena filled with the sound of Drukhari applause, a sound like breaking glass mixed with funeral bells. Archon Viraxis appeared above them, his alien features displaying satisfaction at the spectacle that had unfolded. "Excellent," he announced. "The first game is complete. Those who have survived should feel proud. You have provided adequate entertainment. But do not grow complacent. The trials ahead will test different aspects of your primitive psychology. Rest well tonight, for tomorrow brings new challenges." The survivors were herded through more impossible corridors to what the Drukhari called their accommodations. The dormitory was a brutalist nightmare of tiered metal bunks stretching up into shadows, designed with the same alien aesthetic that valued function over comfort. The air was thick with the smell of fear sweat and despair, punctuated by the quiet sobbing of those who had finally grasped the full horror of their situation. Marcus found a lower bunk near one of the walls and helped Jackson settle onto the adjacent cot. The scribe's hands were still shaking from the arena, his soft administrator's body pushed well beyond its limits. Around them, the other survivors were claiming their own spaces with the territorial instincts of cornered animals. "Thank you," Jackson whispered, his voice barely audible above the general murmur of the dormitory. "You could have left me to die. Why didn't you?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. Why had he risked his own life for a stranger? The old Marcus Kane, the Cadian shock trooper who had followed orders and trusted in the Emperor's protection, would have said it was duty, but that man had died on Cadia along with his regiment. "Don't know," he finally admitted. "Maybe because someone needs to remember what we used to be before this place changes us into something else." Anya had claimed a top bunk across the narrow aisle, her position giving her a clear view of the dormitory's entrances and potential threats. She stripped off her torn jacket and began examining her shoulder wound, probing the last burn with clinical detachment. "You're both fools," she said quietly, just loud enough for them to hear. "This isn't about honor or duty or any of that Imperial propaganda. This is about survival, pure and simple. The weak die so the strong can live. That's the only law that matters in a place like this." Her words were harsh, but Marcus could hear the pain beneath them. Anya Korvash had learned survival in the worst depths of Necromunda's underhive, where showing weakness meant death and sentiment was a luxury only the dead could afford. She was trying to protect herself the only way she knew how, by cutting away anything that might make her vulnerable. "Maybe," Marcus replied. "But if we lose everything that makes us human, what's the point of surviving?" Before Anya could respond, a disturbance broke out near the center of the dormitory. A massive figure was moving between the bunks, and Marcus recognized him as the pit fighter from earlier. The man was even larger up close, his scarred frame towering over the other survivors as he gathered lesser thugs around him like a pack leader claiming his territory. "Listen up, meat," the pit fighter called out, his voice carrying across the dormitory. "Name's Corvin Vrost, and I run the fighting pits on 17 different hive worlds. I know how games like this work, and I know how to win them." He gestured to the men following him, a collection of criminals and violent types who had gravitated toward his strength like moths to a flame. "Anyone wants to see tomorrow needs to understand the new rules. I'm in charge here. You follow my orders. You get my protection. You don't, and you're on your own when the next game starts." Several of the weaker survivors moved toward Vrost's group, drawn by the promise of protection even if it meant accepting slavery. Marcus could see the calculation in their eyes. Better to be a live servant than a dead hero. "What about food?" asked one of the former nobles, a soft man whose expensive clothes had been replaced by the same gray fatigues as everyone else. "When do we eat?" Vrost laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "When our hosts decide we've earned it. But don't worry, Lord Fancy Pants. The Drukhari want us functional for their games. They'll keep us alive. For now." As if summoned by his words, one of the walls dissolved to reveal a group of Drukhari servants carrying trays of food. The beings were clearly slaves themselves, their movements displaying the mechanical precision of creatures whose will had been broken long ago. They distributed bowls of what looked like protein paste and cups of recycled water, just enough to sustain life without providing comfort. Marcus accepted his ration and examined the gray substance with suspicion. It had no smell and barely any taste, but his body's need for sustenance overrode his caution. Around him, the other survivors were making the same calculation, desperation forcing them to trust their captor's need to keep them alive. "Eat," Anya advised quietly. "Whatever's in it, we'll need our strength for what comes next." She was right, of course. The Drukhari were sadists, but they were also pragmatists. Dead contestants couldn't provide entertainment, so the food was probably safe. Probably. As the survivors ate their meager rations, Vrost continued building his power base among the frightened humans. He spoke of unity and survival, but Marcus could see the predatory calculation behind his words. The pit fighter was creating a hierarchy with himself at the top, using fear and the promise of protection to gather followers who would serve his interests. "You," Vrost called out, pointing at Marcus. "Soldier boy, you showed some spine in the arena. Join up with us, and I'll make sure you get through the next few games." Marcus met the larger man's gaze without flinching. "Thanks for the offer, but I'll take my chances on my own." Vrost's expression darkened. "Bad choice, hero. When the next game starts, you'll remember this conversation, and you'll regret not taking my hand when it was offered." The threat hung in the air between them, but Marcus refused to back down. He had spent too many years watching strong men prey on the weak to start enabling it now, even if defiance meant making enemies he couldn't afford. The lights in the dormitory dimmed to simulate a night cycle, though time had little meaning in this place beyond the windows and natural rhythms. Many of the survivors tried to sleep, but rest was elusive when every shadow might hide a new threat, and every sound could herald the start of another game. Marcus lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling, which was covered in the same flowing Xeno script that decorated the corridors. The alien writing seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at it, forming patterns that suggested meaning just beyond human comprehension. Looking at it too long made his head ache, so he closed his eyes and tried to find some measure of peace. But peace was impossible in a place where torture was entertainment and human suffering was currency. Every time he began to drift off, his mind would replay the images from the arena. The mega bolter tracking its targets, the spray of blood and bone fragments, the casual efficiency with which the Drukhari had slaughtered hundreds of people for sport. Somewhere in the darkness, someone was praying. The words were barely audible, but Marcus recognized the litany of protection that every Imperial citizen learned in childhood. The familiar phrases spoke of the Emperor's shield against the darkness, of faith as armor against the terrors of the galaxy. But the Emperor's protection hadn't saved Kodia. It hadn't prevented Marcus from being captured and brought to this place, and it wouldn't help any of them survive the games that lay ahead. Faith was a comfort for children and fools, and Marcus had been neither for a very long time. Hours passed in fitful dozing punctuated by nightmares and the sounds of others struggling with their own demons. Some of the survivors wept quietly into their thin blankets. Others muttered prayers or curses. A few, like Anya, remained alert and watchful, their survival instincts too sharp to allow true rest. When the lights brightened to signal a new day, they were greeted by the sound of Vrost's voice rallying his followers. The pit fighter had claimed the center of the dormitory as his territory, and nearly half the survivors had gravitated toward his group during the night. Fear made people desperate for leadership, even when that leadership came from someone who viewed them as expendable resources. "Today brings the second game," Vrost announced. "Stick with me and follow my lead. I've survived worse than this in fighting pits across the sector. These alien scum think they know about violence, but they've never faced humans who refuse to break." His words drew nods and murmurs of agreement from his followers, but Marcus could see the doubt in their eyes. They wanted to believe Vrost could protect them, but the arena had shown them how easily the Drukhari could snuff out human life. No amount of bravado would turn away splinter rifles or neural disruptors. The same alien servants returned with another meal of protein paste and water, barely enough to sustain life, but sufficient for the Drukhari's purposes. As the survivors ate, holographic displays materialized throughout the dormitory, showing images of the dark city beyond their prison. Komara was a nightmare made manifest, a sprawling metropolis built in defiance of physics and sanity, where impossible spires twisted through dimensions that human minds couldn't process. The streets teemed with Drukhari in their endless pursuit of sensation and suffering, while enslaved beings from 1,000 worlds served their every twisted desire. In the fighting pits, human gladiators battled alien beasts for the amusement of crowds that fed on their pain. In the flesh markets, modified slaves were bought and sold like livestock, their bodies altered according to their purchasers' whims. In the laboratories, homunculi pursued their art of transforming living beings into grotesque masterpieces of agony and beauty. The images were meant to break their spirits, to show them the fate that awaited those who failed to provide adequate entertainment. But Marcus found himself studying the displays with tactical interest, noting potential weaknesses and escape routes, even as his rational mind told him that escape from Komara was impossible. When the meal was finished, the wall dissolved again to admit a group of Kabbalite warriors. Their weapons were powered but not immediately threatening, suggesting this was an escort rather than an execution. The message was clear: time for the second game. The humans were herded through more impossible corridors toward their next trial. The architecture around them shifted subtly as they walked, walls flowing like liquid to reconfigure themselves according to some alien logic. Marcus tried to memorize their route, but the changing layout made mapping impossible. They emerged into a laboratory that made Marcus's skin crawl with revulsion. The chamber was filled with bubbling vats of unknown chemicals, surgical equipment that gleamed with malevolent purpose, and glass tanks containing things that might once have been human, but had been transformed into writhing masses of modified flesh. This was a homunculus laboratory, where the dark science of the Drukhari reached its most refined expression. The beings who worked here were artists of pain, sculptors of living flesh, who viewed the human form as raw material for their twisted creativity. At the center of the laboratory, 60 metal tables had been arranged in neat rows. Each table held a single object, a disc of what looked like living flesh about the size of a dinner plate. The substance pulsed with its own rhythm, like a severed heart trying to continue its function, and Marcus could see veins of luminescent fluid flowing beneath its surface. Archon Viraxis appeared above them, his holographic form radiating satisfaction at their obvious discomfort. "Welcome to your second trial," he announced. "Before you lie examples of living putty, a creation of our flesh crafters that responds to touch and intention. Each disc contains a symbol that you must carve from its substance using only the needle provided. You have 10 minutes to complete the task." Small silver needles materialized beside each disc, their points gleaming with some unknown coating. Marcus could see symbols appearing on displays above each table: Imperial Aquilas, Mechanicus Cogs, Chaos Stars, and other heraldic designs that carried deep meaning within human culture. "Be warned," Viraxis continued, his voice carrying amusement at their growing horror. "The putty is semi-sentient and will resist your efforts. Should you fail to carve the symbol correctly, or should you take longer than the allotted time, the substance will express its displeasure." To demonstrate, he gestured toward one of the laboratory walls, where another disc of flesh putty was mounted. A Drukhari technician jabbed it carelessly with a needle, and the substance immediately began to convulse. Within seconds, it exploded in a spray of acidic bile that ate through the metal wall like it was paper. "Choose your tables," the Archon commanded. "And remember, precision is survival." The survivors spread out among the tables, each claiming a disc and its associated needle. Marcus found himself beside Jackson, who was staring at his flesh putty with undisguised revulsion. The symbol above the scribe's table was an imperial aquila. It spread wings and lightning bolts, requiring delicate work to carve properly. Marcus's own symbol was simpler, a mechanicus cog that should be achievable with steady hands and careful planning. He picked up the needle and examined its point, noting that the coating seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury. "Begin," Viraxis announced. Marcus pressed the needle against his disc and immediately understood why the Archon had called the substance semi-sentient. The flesh putty recoiled from the touch of metal, its surface rippling with what could only be described as fear or pain. When he pressed harder, trying to start his first cut, the substance actively resisted him, flowing away from the needle point like it was trying to escape. Around him, other contestants were struggling with the same problem. The putty fought every attempt to cut it, and when they applied too much pressure, it would lash out with pseudopods of corrosive flesh that burned exposed skin. Several people were already nursing chemical burns from their attempts to force compliance from their assigned discs. Marcus forced himself to remain calm and think tactically. The putty was alive, which meant it would respond to pain and pleasure like any living thing. Instead of fighting its resistance, he began making gentle, shallow cuts that barely penetrated the surface. The substance still recoiled, but less violently, and gradually he was able to establish the outline of his cog design. Beside him, Jackson was having more difficulty. His soft administrator's hands weren't used to precise manual work, and his natural gentleness made him reluctant to cause pain even to a mass of alien flesh. His cuts were tentative and uneven, and his putty was beginning to show signs of agitation. "Steady pressure," Marcus advised quietly. "Don't second-guess yourself. Make the cut and move on." Jackson nodded and tried to follow the advice, but his hands were shaking with nervous tension. The Aquila design was complex, requiring multiple curves and precise angles that his inexperienced fingers struggled to achieve. On Marcus's other side, Anya was working with the focused intensity of someone whose life depended on perfection. Her symbol was a chaos star, 8 points radiating from a central hub, and she was carving it with the same precision she had once used to pick locks and disable security systems. Her putty writhed and fought, but she ignored its resistance and continued her work with mechanical determination. Time ticked by with agonizing slowness. Marcus completed the outer ring of his cog and began working on the internal teeth, each cut requiring careful measurement to ensure proper spacing. The putty had grown more compliant as it learned to accept his touch, but it still flinched away from the needle with each new incision. A scream from across the laboratory made everyone look up. One of Vrost's followers had pushed too hard on his putty, trying to force it into compliance through brute strength. The substance had responded by exploding in his face, covering him with acidic bile that ate through skin and muscle like concentrated acid. The man collapsed, clawing at his dissolving features while his screams echoed through the chamber. Drukhari technicians moved in to remove the body, their movements casual and efficient. To them, the man's death was just another data point in their ongoing study of human behavior under stress. His agony meant nothing beyond its entertainment value. The display had its intended effect on the other contestants. Several people began working faster, panic overriding precision as they raced to complete their symbols before time expired. But haste led to mistakes, and mistakes led to punishment. More explosions followed as contestants triggered their putty's defensive responses through careless handling. Marcus forced himself to maintain steady progress despite the carnage around him. He had learned patience during his military service, the kind of deliberate calm that kept soldiers alive when panic would get them killed. Each cut was planned and executed with care, building toward the final design through incremental progress. Jackson was struggling badly now, his hands cramping from the unfamiliar strain and his symbol only half completed. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he tried to speed up his work, but the putty seemed to sense his desperation and fought him more vigorously. "Time remaining. 3 minutes," announced a mechanical voice from the laboratory speakers. The announcement triggered a wave of desperate activity as contestants realized how little time they had left. More putty explosions followed, each one claiming another life in a spray of corrosive flesh. The laboratory floor was becoming slippery with acidic bile that ate through boots and burned exposed skin. Marcus completed the final tooth of his cog with 90 seconds to spare, then turned to help Jackson with his struggling Aquila. The scribe's hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely hold the needle, and his symbol was a ragged approximation of the imperial design. "Here," Marcus said, taking the needle from Jackson's trembling fingers. "Let me finish the wings." "Time remaining. 1 minute." Marcus worked with desperate precision, carving the final details of the Aquila's spread wings while Jackson's putty writhed in protest. The substance was clearly agitated by the change in handlers, and Marcus could feel it building toward an explosive response. Time remaining, 30 seconds. The lightning bolts beneath the Aquila were the hardest part, requiring delicate curves that the putty resisted with all its alien strength. Marcus pressed harder, forcing the needle through stubborn flesh while the disc convulsed beneath his hands. Time remaining, 10 seconds. Marcus completed the final lightning bolt just as the timer reached 0. Around them, a dozen more explosions claimed the lives of contestants who had failed to complete their symbols in time. The laboratory floor was now ankle-deep in acidic bile that continued to eat through anything organic. "Acceptable," Archon Viraxis announced, his tone suggesting mild disappointment at the survival rate. "Those who remain have shown adequate precision under pressure. You will advance to the next trial." The survivors, perhaps 40 now, were herded out of the laboratory and back to their dormitory. Several people were nursing chemical burns from contact with the flesh putty, and everyone's hands were stained with the residue of the alien substance. The smell of dissolved flesh clung to their clothes and skin like a memorial to those who hadn't been quick enough. Back in the dormitory, Vrost was rebuilding his power structure among the diminished group of survivors. The pit fighter had lost several followers in the laboratory, but fear and desperation continued to drive people toward his promise of protection. "Told you precision mattered," he announced to his remaining gang. "But that was nothing compared to what's coming. The Drukhari are just getting started with us." Anya had claimed a new bunk closer to Marcus and Jackson, her territorial instincts adapting to the reduced population. Her hands were steady as she cleaned the putty residue from her needle, but Marcus could see the strain in her eyes. Each game was taking a psychological toll, even on someone as hardened as she was. "You saved him again," she observed, nodding toward Jackson. "That's twice now you've risked yourself for someone who can't pull his own weight." Marcus said nothing, but he helped Jackson tend to the chemical burns on his hands. The scribe was clearly struggling with the violence and horror of their situation, his soft administrative background providing no preparation for the casual brutality of the Dark City. "I keep thinking this has to be a nightmare," Jackson whispered, "that I'll wake up in my cell and this will all have been some kind of stress-induced hallucination." "We're awake," Marcus replied quietly, "and this is real. The only question is whether we let it break us or find a way to keep going." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus wasn't sure he believed them. The Drukhari were masters of psychological warfare, experts at finding the pressure points that would shatter human minds. How long could anyone maintain their sanity in a place designed to celebrate suffering? The lights dimmed again, signaling another night cycle. But sleep was even more elusive now, haunted by the memory of exploding flesh and the screams of the dying. Marcus lay in his bunk and tried not to think about what fresh horror tomorrow would bring. Around him, the other survivors were dealing with their trauma in different ways. Some prayed to the Emperor for deliverance that would never come. Others plotted escape routes through facilities that defied mapping. A few simply stared at the ceiling and tried to process experiences that human minds weren't meant to endure. But all of them knew the truth, even if they couldn't bring themselves to voice it. They were trapped in a nightmare that fed on their suffering, imprisoned by beings who viewed human agony as the highest form of art. And tomorrow would bring fresh games, new torments, and the gradual erosion of everything that made them human. The only question was, how many of them would still be themselves when it was finally over?